Hello and welcome everybody to Tigrai panel discussion. Today we will reflect on the extraordinary turn of events that happened in Tigray over the last couple of weeks. And it will be me, Tigrai, hosting the discussion today. And we have Alex Dival today with us, apart from the regular Tigrai panelists, Goitom Gebrolul and Patrick White as well. We also have Chelsea Baldwin, who will assist us technically behind the scene. Alex Dival, I don't think he needs any introduction, but for completeness, I will say a few words about him. He is Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation and a research professor at the Tufts University, United States. Has done his PhD in social anthropology at the University of Oxford, and his dissertation, I think, was on the Darfur famine in 1984, and he has written extensively and spoken extensively about Sudan and Ethiopia, and we're really looking forward to have him with us today. Welcome, everybody.
It's good to be with you.
Thanks. We appreciate your generosity with time, Alex. Really appreciate that. So before we go into the discussion, I thought I would give, if you would bear with me, I would give a brief recap of the main events starting from the war up until now. And then we go to the discussion. So please bear with me. So generally, there is a lack of information coming out from Tigray in large part due to the information blackout imposed by the government. So we don't really have a clear picture of what transpired, but from the information available, be it from the interviews and official communications, I think we can draw a fair picture of events. And so the war started on the night of November 4, 2020. The allied forces of the Ethiopian Federal Defense Forces, the Eritrean army, and the Amhara militia invaded Tigray after, according to the government's telling, forces allied with the TPLF attacked a military base in Mekelle and around Mekelle. And the TDF initially tried to engage the allied forces in a conventional war, but because of the huge imbalance in power, I think after 2 weeks, the TPLF had to make some strategic change in terms of retreating from Mekelle, for instance, and turning into what we might call guerrilla warfare. And at some point, the TDF was overwhelmed with the allied forces. And I think during this period, it had lost some senior members in Siyum Mesfin, Abais Haye, and Asmelash Woldeslase, and other people. And I know, Alex Dival, you have written a beautiful obituary and in memoriam for Siyum Mesfin. Maybe you will want to mention that later. And then they had to regroup, and they launched some operations. I will briefly mention two of the big operations, according to the information that I have managed to collect. The first one is the Siyum operation, named after Siyum Mesfin. I think that operation helped the TDF to gain some ground, some footing in the war that gave them some momentum. And then they launched another operation. I think that started the beginning of June, from the information that we could piece together. Alula operation, named after the Alula Abanaga, a great Tigrayan army general from the 19th century who fought against the Sudanese and Egyptians. And that resulted in the TDF taking control of Mekelle, and that is the event or the operation that sent shockwaves around the globe. So this, I think, is the general picture of what happened over the last 8 years. But there are a lot of unknowns that we couldn't possibly know, like what was the role of the Eritreans, for instance? Were the Eritreans invited into Tigray, or did they enter on their own volition? And when the TDF left Mekelle, was there any agreement between the Eritreans and the Ethiopians that this was happening, or did the development, the events come as a surprise to the Eritreans? What kind of damage have the Eritreans sustained? This remains to be very unknown. And my first question will be to Alex to help us fill in some of the gaps that we couldn't possibly learn from the information that we have. So Alex, please go enlighten us about what your take is, what you think happened, and how the TDF, against all odds, managed to take control of Mekelle and I think much of Tigray now.
Thank you very much. It's good to join you. I think the first thing that is important is to make the distinction between TPLF and TDF, because the Tigray Defense Forces were constituted in November after the war broke out, not just by TPLF, but by several other groups as well. It included other opposition parties in Tigray. It included veterans, retirees who had left the TPLF some years ago, who remobilized, including senior army officers, such as the former Chief of Staff, General Tzadkan Gebretensai, and many ordinary Tigrayans just flocked to take up arms because of the atrocities that were being inflicted upon them and their families. So the TDF was born of necessity and circumstance, and the TPLF is part of it, but it is not identical to TPLF. I think that is the first point. The second point is that the conventional armaments of that were in existence in Tigray in November were almost entirely obliterated by a drone campaign. And it is widely believed that the drones belonged to the United Arab Emirates and were flown from the Assab Air Base in Eritrea. By the end of the drone offensive and the conventional offensives on three fronts, from Eritrea, from the south and from the west, the existing force of Tigrayan armed forces were in complete disarray. And they retreated into, first of all, to Hagar Salam, and then into various mountainous areas where they reconstituted themselves. And the core institution was the Central Command, which includes members of TPLF and veteran military leaders, including General Tzadkan, who was left TPLF some time ago. During December and January, the TDF was essentially on the run. It was scattered. It was in the mountains of southern Tigray on the borders of Amhara, and it was small. It was entirely on foot, and in the words of General Tzadkan, it was biting the dust. And the question is, how did it manage to reconstitute itself? And I think the key was two things. One was the leadership of some veterans from the previous civil war of the 1980s, who knew exactly what was required to constitute a guerrilla army, and the determination and commitment of many young volunteers who mobilized out of desperation. Really, the attitude was, our farms, our villages are being destroyed, our sisters, our mothers, our daughters are being raped, we will be killed, so let us mobilize. And that combination one is that a population that is mobilized, politicized, and armed cannot be ruled against its will. You cannot be terrorized submission. And the second is the tenet that numbers and force alone do not determine the outcome of a military encounter. What is important is the moral factor and the intellectual factor, the leadership and the commitment. And the commitment on the Tigrayan side were greater than the leadership and commitment on the Ethiopian side and on the Eritrean side. So what was interesting as this series of offensives and counteroffensives unfold, as the series of counteroffensives unfolded, was that the Tigrayan military leadership was consistently confident that it could prevail, and that it could prevail particularly against the Ethiopian National Defense Force, because although it was outnumbered and outgunned, the organization, the command on the Ethiopian federal side was in a shambles. The Eritreans were a more formidable adversary, but also they were a conscript army unwilling to fight. And it was only a matter of time before they were ground down and gave up. And what I found, one of the things I found quite interesting was that consistently as this unfolded, the expectation, the analysis and expectation among the leadership on the TDF side was consistently borne out. Whereas on the Ethiopian side, there was an arrogance, a hubris. They said, "Oh, we are winning. It's a matter of time. It's an automatic victory." The Eritreans, meanwhile, said nothing. Isaias was too wily, too smart to actually committing himself to making public statements. And one of the questions that arises, particularly during Operation Lula, is why was it that the Ethiopian National Defense Force made a series of military blunders that were rather rudimentary blunders, that sending large numbers of heavily armored convoys essentially into the lion's den, into a trap. And this has not been fully explained, but the most likely explanation is that they believed their own rhetoric. They actually believed that they were on the point of victory, perhaps because Prime Minister Abiy insisted this was the case, perhaps for other reasons. At any rate, their speed of military collapse was faster than I think anyone expected, including the TDF leadership. But the outcome, I think, was clear from several months ago. So that these extraordinarily fierce battles were fought, in which essentially the Ethiopian National Defense Forces surrendered more than half its fighting capacity and its armaments. And it's mobilizing an army or running an army is not simply a matter of numbers. It's also a matter of that tight organization and morale and doctrine and so on. So numerically speaking, the ENDF has been reduced by something like 50%, but in terms of actual fighting capacity, it's something more like 75%. And meanwhile, the Tigray Defense Forces are extremely well armed and very capably led. And they will achieve their immediate military objectives, I have no doubt, of controlling the remainder of Tigray. The only question is, what are the political consequences of continuing their military activities in this manner?
Yeah, interesting. It goes to you seem to be emphasizing that it was the role of the leadership in the TDF, within the TDF ranks, that played a decisive role in defeating the Ethiopian Defense Forces. Now, the common wisdom is that the Eritreans also have leadership skills that are comparable to those within the TDF party, the TDF ranks. And if the Eritreans were also fully involved in the war, it becomes a little bit harder to explain how the TDF got the upper hand. And what I suppose that the first question that I would like to ask you, Alex, is what exactly was the role of the Eritrean troops in Tigray. Now, we keep hearing that they were using the Ethiopian troops as cannon fodders. They weren't really engaging in active war fronts, and there was a serious miscommunication between the generals in the Ethiopian army and in the Eritreans. If you would like to opine on that matter, Alex.
I'm not privy to the details of this. I don't fully understand what happened. What is clear is that the TDF chose the ENDF as the softer target and armed itself from the ENDF. Now, why it was that the Eritreans did not intervene and try and prevent this, or maybe they did try and intervene and were unable to do so, I don't know. But the upshot is that the military leadership in Eritrea was smarter, and it has withdrawn with its military more or less intact. It has suffered losses, but it is still able to fight. The ENDF is practically unable to fight.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Goitom, I will proceed to you. You get the sense that something must have gone wrong within the when they launched the Alula operation. They must have done something right. And if you could speak to why the Alula operation was a very successful operation.
Thank you, Tigrai. Like Alex, I also don't have the details of what actually happened militarily. I think, military outcomes like this are going to be determined by a number of factors. And we will know, we can sort of make a proper estimate of that at a much later stage. At this stage, I think it still, there are some sort of factors that we can look to that could shed light on why we had this military outcome. I think I would point to the organizational characteristics of the Eritrean and Ethiopian army and the TDF on the other hand. The contrast is quite stark. And based on comparative evidence, I think we can infer, what might have happened. So, you look at both Eritrea and Ethiopia, you see that the power structures in both regimes are quite personalized. Neither Isaias nor Abiy Ahmed are very fond of institutions, and that also applies to military policy or military administration. So an interesting factor here is, for example, that the chief of staff of Ethiopia's army has been changed 4 times in the last 3 years. And that's quite a significant factor. On the Eritrean side, and I think also Abiy is driven by the same motive, a high turnover of both political and military staff is used as a tactic to keep opponents off guard and as a way of controlling opponents. The last one that was changed was General Adam, and that was, I believe, also driven by political factors. We've heard rumors that General Adam was opposed to the war, and Abiy Ahmed did not appreciate that sort of professional independence. The second issue, the second characteristic I would draw attention to is that of discipline. So if you look at the behavior of the ENDF and EDF, you'll notice that there was a great deal of rape and looting that they were engaged in. A significant indicator of lack of discipline, and they the fact that it was quite widespread indicates that this was a political decision, and essentially thus a characteristic of these organizations. The other indicator one could look to is that of the way they treat POWs. The TDF does not kill its POWs, it takes care of them according to the Geneva Convention, whereas the Ethiopian soldiers would massacre and kill unarmed POWs and take photos and video recordings of this for their amusement. And this is a significant indicator of lack of discipline in both the ENDF and the EDF. And the way this sort of has implications for battlefield performance is lack of checks and balances. So we saw, for example, with regards to the Tigray war, that Abiy Ahmed was advised that this would have disastrous outcomes that we see today, that these have already manifested. And he went to war despite expertise advice. We also see during the war that there's a political need to declare victory rapidly, very quickly. And that led to the use of human waves, and essentially, rather than sort of pursue or to sort of pursue the war driven by military logic, it was driven by political logic of needing to take over Mekelle in 2 weeks, and thus I believe that led to the decimation of large parts of his army. The other political factor we see is his desire to punish the Tigrayan population led to a number of atrocities, which again led to high recruits for the TDF. And all of these factors are, I think, outcomes of the political characteristics of or the organizational characteristics of the ENDF and EDF. And you can sort of contrast that to the TDF, which is a very different type of military organization. Other, I think, mistakes or outcomes that come from these types of organizations is an incapacity to learn from mistakes and rectify one's behavior based on past knowledge. And also, I imagine it will have implications for the troops' capacity to take orders and behave in a disciplined manner. So, whilst we can't say for sure with absolute certainty that these factors were what led to the success of the Alula operation and the overall military success of the TDF, I believe that these organizational characteristics severely weakened Abiy Ahmed and his Azapoka's battlefield performance. And essentially their weaknesses were strategic advantages for the TDF. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, but indeed, I think that the chopping and changing of the leadership at the of the army betrays the sense that there wasn't a clear roadmap when it comes to the Tigray war. It was just a capricious person making decisions depending on the current mood, and the inconsistent stories and all the narratives that they were trying to create pointers to an understanding that they didn't really know what they were doing in Tigray, apart from the desire to crush the Tigrayans into subjugation. That's the only conclusion you draw. And it's reflected in the story that they have been trying to create after the TDF took control of Mekelle. In the beginning, they seemed to suggest that they withdrew from Mekelle because they wanted Tigrayan farmers to peacefully plow. That was the story that was told in the beginning, and then they changed it and said that, well, we had to withdraw because we knew that we were in a war that we couldn't possibly win. And then they later changed it to, well, we had to withdraw because we have a bigger fish to fry. And it keeps changing, and that tells me that there isn't any leadership and roadmap at the within the Ethiopian army ranks. Patrick, what's the sense you get when you hear these disparate and inconsistent stories coming from Ethiopian government by way of explaining what happened on the 28th of June? What's the sense you get?
Well, I feel obviously we have to take everything the Ethiopian government says with a grain of salt, and especially in terms of the reasons they've provided to justify why they withdrew. A more cynical view would say that Abiy is pausing the war in an effort to resupply his force because they've been decimated in such a way. But what we're seeing happening now is a new form of warfare being waged. So I call it the Gazification of Tigray. So what you're seeing is like what happened in 2005 in Gaza, where the Israeli forces withdrew and pulled out their settlements, and then sort of coordinated with Egypt in blocking off the entire Gaza Strip, everything that comes in and out. You're seeing that happening in Tigray, where the Ethiopian army withdrew, but then all of the bridges into Tigray were destroyed. Telecommunications, electricity, the banking, water, all sorts of essential services have been stopped, presumably by the Ethiopian government. And you're seeing a mass arrest campaigns of Tigrayans in Addis Ababa. So this belies the idea that this is a war just against the TPLF or against political elites from within the Tigrayan community, that this is actually a war writ large against the Tigrayan population. And you also saw in Western Tigray, that there's sort of a mobilization campaign taking place. And we've seen in Alamata that the forces withdrawing have been looting the civilian population. So it's almost that they know they've been defeated and they're trying to take as much as they can from these areas as they retreat. But all of these actions belie the idea that the government was withdrawing in an effort to allow farmers to grow their crops. Why would you withdraw and then still be lobbying against the World Food Program airdropping aid? Like, why would that be an issue? And we have all of these rumors and sort of innuendos about that, you know, the TDF is working alongside the World Food Program, and the World Food Program is actually airdropping weapons, and there's no evidence of this. But these are all efforts to delegitimize providing humanitarian assistance. So you have to ask yourself, why is the government blocking off the entire area and trying to delegitimize providing assistance to civilians, and then also going after Tigrayans, not just whatever people that are engaging in political actions, which would be wrong in and of itself, but you're hearing people playing Wayane songs being arrested. You're hearing just people in the Hayaulet area being arrested. It seems like it's a war in Addis Ababa on Tigrayans as a people because they support the so-called military junta. So that's sort of my view on like why this ceasefire.
So it looks like that the government they have lost the conventional war, and now they have declared another form of war by imposing blockade and by cutting off all sorts of communication and by preventing food from going to Tigray. They seem to have gone into a different kind of war against the people of Tigray, and I'm sure Alex will later talk about how they are using starvation and other weapons against the people, but he seems to have popped out for some reason. Until he returns, I will ask Goitom, how do you think Goitom will other political parties in Ethiopia, like the OLF, for instance, or OLF, who at a fundamental level agree with what the TDF is doing. They might have some disagreements in terms of what the TPLF had done historically, but they agree that Ethiopia should be a federal system, that there should be more loosening of the structure, not more centralization, as the Ethiopian government seems to be pushing for. And as they see that the TDF successfully defending this idea that they in principle support, how do you think they will receive the victory of the TDF?
They've already received it, I think, quite positively from what we see. Not for formal statements have been made, but their supporters, their support base and constituency are quite sympathetic. And I think it's quite significant. It will have implications for them. What this military victory means is that Abiy Ahmed's project cannot succeed. I don't think it would have succeeded anyway, but I think it could have lasted much longer had it not been for this military victory. The project of personalized autocracy, creeping unitary nationalism. It's not creeping, actually, it's quite overt, but I would say creeping desire to change the federal constitution or multinational constitution. These things are, I think, history now, in the sense that there will still be a desire to pursue them, but they're not going to have the military and institutional capabilities to pursue them. And that obviously has implications for other opposition groups that oppose this project. So I think it will be warmly welcomed, and I think they'll also take advantage of that in the coming weeks to those that conduct insurgency to expand their territorial reach. Namely, I think it will be the OLA that will fall in this category. Whereas the political parties, those that pursue nonviolent struggles, will also take advantage of this to pressure the government, and the international community as well will use this opportunity to push for a national dialogue. I mean, it's important to emphasize that that's the purpose. That's what we're fighting for, and that's what's on the agenda. There's nothing sinister or extreme. It's really a desire for different political factions in Ethiopia to sit down and solve their differences peacefully. I'll stop there.
Yeah, but interesting. So do you think, Patrick, I will come back to you until Alex hopefully returns. Do you think that the Ethiopian government will bring itself to admit that this is a war that it can't win, that if anything it's only going to incentivize other political parties in Ethiopia to go the way of the TDF, and that if Ethiopia is going to have a future, there should be a fundamental change in direction in terms of how you engage with people who have political differences? Or do you think they will double down on what they have been doing, and are they pushing Ethiopia down to the abyss? What do you think is the government's end game here?
I think
we have Alex back. Yeah.
I think it's clear that the government's end game here, the governments both of Ethiopia and Eritrea, that the end game here was to devastate the society of Tigray, to make it so that they can't ever come back to power, or in their view threaten their ability to control the region. That you saw even Abiy making statements that now we've equalized the regions. Through this war in Tigray, we've equalized. But what does that mean? That means that we've dragged down Tigray by destroying its everything about the society, its economy, its political leadership, its capacity to securitize the society. We've gone through, raped and pillaged, and now it's being equalized with the rest of Ethiopia. So what does that tell you about the mindset of the government, of why they started this war? It seems essentially the purpose of the war was to drag Tigray down. But in doing so, the Ethiopian government has weakened itself to a state that we don't even know if it can defend its sovereignty against Eritrea. We don't even know what the status of the relationship between Abiy and Isaias is now, because both regimes are so secretive. On Isaias' side, you have him saying nothing, and on Abiy's side, you have a whole litany of untruths being said. But right now, the Ethiopian government is unable to withstand the Tigrayan forces, and it's also abdicated its sovereignty in many ways to Eritrea. So in trying to destroy its ultimate enemy, it has essentially weakened itself. And this is in many ways the biggest gift to Isaias that he could have ever given, because Ethiopia is descending into chaos now. And it's sort of unable to exert itself in the region in any sort of significant manner.
Yeah, but welcome back, Alex. We've been reflecting on the positions and posturing that the government has been taken post June 28, when the TPLF took control of Mekelle. And the government has been saying things which are, to put them mildly, contradictory, right? On the one hand, they say that they withdrew from Tigray to help the people of Tigray reflect on what they have done over the last 8 months, and to allow them to do their farming and other stuff. But on the other hand, the government has imposed blockade on literally everything to Tigray. And I'm wondering if you could help us make sense of what the government's thinking or roadmap is in terms of going forward, and in terms of maintaining the federation, in terms of solving the problem in Tigray long term. What do you think is the government thinking, if you could?
I think the government thinking is a mystery, and I think it's a mystery even to the government. One of the difficulties with understanding the strategy of Abiy Ahmed is that he appears to put more faith in rhetoric and providence and fate than he does in actually a thorough empirical and analytical understanding of the situation, his own strengths and weaknesses. And what has been actually really very interesting to watch over the last week is that in the short term, his strategy works. He suffered during June an absolutely shattering military defeat. He also won a handsome victory in the election in the places where it was held. And he exudes an air of calm, of confidence, of normality, which is enormously reassuring to the population. I mean, and I have no doubt that the reason why he won the election so handsomely, I mean, the official results aren't in, but I think we know the result, is that he was able to project the image of a strong and optimistic and confident leader. And he's still an optimistic and confident. He has no base for it, but he still projects that. And that makes him hugely popular with certain segments. And there is a bubble around Addis Ababa. There always has been a bubble. I recall in 1990, even into early 1991, for the residents of Addis Ababa, especially the elite there, it appeared as a surprise that there was a war. They had never really taken account of the war. And it was only when the war came to Shoah that they began to think there's a war. And until that moment, they assumed that the regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam was utterly impregnable. Now, and Mengistu was nothing if not a realist. He may also have had some of the same shortcomings as a military strategist, that Abiy does, his belief in sheer force and numbers and so on. But he was definitely a realist. In Abiy, we have somebody who closes down half his embassies because his ambassadors won't tell him what he wants to hear. And so he argues, well, the diaspora, by which he means the diaspora which is favorable to him, can do a better job. He's dismantled the army. He already had dismantled the army essentially before the war began. And now he is saying, I can mobilize 1 million men in a militia. Well, he can mobilize 1 million men. They will be slaughtered. In the economy, he has shifted towards a very conventional sort of neoliberal approach, and that is also going to be hazardous. But at least it's comprehensible. At least it makes sense, even though it's unlikely to deliver any results. Not least because of the cataclysmic economic situation that is unfolding, partly because of the war. So it is as though Abiy is living in a fantasy land. He has built these illusions around him, and a large number of people in and around Addis, including some diplomats, I might add, have bought into this illusion. So the question is, will there be enough people within the government who don't subscribe to that, who actually are able to persuade him, you have to negotiate, you have to concede that you are not, that your dream of this great imperial Ethiopia is never going to happen, and you have to talk first of all to the TDF, then also to the Oromos, etc. Or is he going to carry on blithely believing in his own destiny, his own omnipotence, until the country falls apart? And it's not clear to me what is going to happen.
Yeah, well, I don't believe that there is any person within the Prosperity Party who would muster the courage and go to Abiy and tell him that what he's doing isn't something that would work. But I don't believe that will happen. But another question that I would like to ask you, Alex, in this respect, is you are, to my knowledge, one of the first people who raised the alarm bells that the government was using starvation as a weapon of war. And only if many people could have heeded to your advice, you wonder how many lives would have been saved by now. But I think that is a discussion for another time. Now, I would like to get your opinion as to, well, I think at first I could understand why the international community bought the Abiy story and went along with him. But by now it has become clear that the regime is using starvation as a weapon. But the international community seems to be absolutely silent apart from issuing this very off-the-shelf statements every now and then. They don't seem to intervene and act and tell him enough is enough. Why do you think that is? That's, I think, one of the things that has been extremely difficult for us to understand.
It has been difficult. It's been very painful. And I think one of the reasons for it is that the Ethiopian government has had the skills of manipulating the humanitarian information and the humanitarian sector to its advantage. But it's very interesting in the Security Council meeting last Friday. Essentially, there were two camps there. There was the camp of the United States and the Europeans, especially the Irish, but all the European countries, that basically put the humanitarian crisis front and foremost, saying, here is the disaster, it needs immediate action. And they also said the Ethiopian state is in danger of crisis and collapse. And then we had China and the African countries represented by Kenya, and also Russia, although Russia made a few additional remarks. And they had the other emphasis. They emphasized very much, we must be respectful of the Ethiopian state. We're worried about the Ethiopian state, and then we're also worried about the humanitarian crisis. Now, a couple of interesting things here. One is, none of the countries that beforehand might have raised a procedural objection to debating the issue of the crisis in Tigray at the UN Security Council. None of them did that, especially China. So essentially they had conceded the key point. This is a crisis for the UN Security Council. Second, none of them accepted the Ethiopian government narrative, not even China, not even Russia. They actually, they maybe had not moved as far as the US narrative of it being an enormous crisis, but they had moved distinctly away from the Ethiopian government narrative. And then the third point to bear in mind is that underpinning this is the fact that these two issues, the humanitarian crisis and the state crisis, actually interlock in the same way. And there is an awareness that if Abiy does not permit sufficient large-scale expeditious humanitarian access through Ethiopia, from Addis Ababa, from Djibouti, the people of Tigray, number one, will not consider themselves Ethiopian any longer. And there's long historical precedents for this, like Ireland. The famine in Ireland in the 1840s was one of the seeds of Irish nationalism. Ukraine, the famine in Ukraine in the 1930s meant that the Ukrainians basically concluded we can no longer live under the rule of Moscow. And countries are aware of that. And related to that, if the Tigray Defense Force manages to capture Western Tigray and the border crossings into Sudan, especially Grenada, and opens up a humanitarian corridor from that direction, the international community will take it. They will not allow people to starve. I mean, it's too late, frankly, for many people, but they will do what they can. And once that humanitarian pipeline from Sudan is opened, we begin to see the umbilical cord between Tigray and the rest of Ethiopia being cut. Now, it's very striking. In the government of Tigray ceasefire call, there's two things to read into that. The first is the language. The language is very bellicose. It's calling Abiy a fascist clique, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically saying, we don't want to talk to you. But substantively, the provisions in that are ones that the international community recognizes as legitimate, including humanitarian access, including some form of third-party monitoring, and including, and this is, I think, the key one, respect for the Constitution. And what, by insisting on the legitimacy of the government that was elected and the legitimacy of the federal constitution, that proposal is sending a message to Addis Ababa. We are not leaving. We are still part of this constitutional order if you wish to uphold it. We are not the ones who are going to abrogate that constitution. Should you, federal government, wish to abrogate it, then it's a different story. So there is, the substantive provisions are quite restrained. The language is quite bellicose.
Yeah, I think that the issue of starvation is very, it's very serious, and I hope we will return to it one day and talk in detail about that. But for now, if you don't mind, let's go back to the TDF and Goitom, I will return to you. I think the Abiy regime's thinking in the beginning was that he could create Ethiopia in his own image by crushing all the enemies, right? And in registering this extraordinary victory, what the TPLF has, in my opinion, demonstrated is that wouldn't work in Ethiopia, and that a new settlement, a new solution, a new arrangement has to be sought in Ethiopia. I would want you to reflect on what the victory means in terms of the Ethiopian state and in terms of Tigray's place in Ethiopia and in terms of what other peoples would aspire to become now, given that the Abiy dream, for all intents and purposes, is buried now. So first, I would want you to reflect on what it means, and second, how do you think should the Tigray government or the TDF should capitalize on its military victory in its political dealings with the Abiy regime or with other stakeholders in Ethiopia?
Thank you, Tigrai. The way I see it, this was a fight over the constitution, like Alex mentioned just now. Abiy Ahmed and his allies have made their opposition to the Ethiopian constitution quite clear by annexing through ethnic cleansing territories, or attempting to annex at least territories in Western Tigray, by inviting in foreign forces, engaging in the type of massacres that they've engaged in. This was a clear attempt to subjugate one member of the Ethiopian Federation and to crush it. After Tigray, it was clear that the next target would be some other part of the federation, or in fact, the federal order itself. And Abiy Ahmed's constituency made their demands for that very clear. If you look at many of the banners that they were holding in one of the demonstrations in Bahardar a couple of months ago, they were demanding that Oromia be dissolved as a state, and that the multinational federation be dissolved. So this was really a war over the federation, and the TDF's victory, I think, is seen as a victory in favor of maintaining the federation. This was a victory for all federalist forces, and it has been welcomed as such. And it was also, I think, a war between principle and lawlessness. The way, one of the characteristics of Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki is their total disregard for both international law and domestic law. So, and you see that with the TDF, and I would say TPLF in the past as well. There are always some principles and ideologies that they want to use as anchors. The disputes and conflicts with various groups is always framed around principles and laws. Since Abiy Ahmed has taken power, he's been creating a culture of lawlessness and essentially a political structure in which an individual can exercise power without any checks and balances. And that's essentially a copy of what's going on in Eritrea, which is his best ally. So I would say this was a victory for federalist forces in Ethiopia, and victory for those that want to settle their disputes through political means and through dialogue. And I think it has been welcome as such around Ethiopia. Moving on, we're in a very sort of peculiar situation where the only, I think, guarantee the TDF has is force, military force. So it has to use that military force both as a deterrent to deter Abiy Ahmed from making any more attempts at crushing Tigray and engaging in genocidal violence. But I think it's going to be important to use that to compel him to sit on the negotiating table as well. How they're going to, the right combination of military force and political means that is required to get there, I'm not exactly sure what that would look like. But on the other side, on the side of the federal government, it's quite clear that the only thing that they respect is force. So I don't think we'll have a change of heart on the side of Abiy Ahmed, suddenly that will make him, a more political solution orientated person. The type, I think, it's important to emphasize that the types of atrocities and actions that he's engaged in, these are the types of actions that define you as a person and as a political group. You can't, for example, differentiate the Holocaust from Hitler and the Nazi Party. That was an action that defined them as a group. And the same way with Abiy Ahmed, he has engaged in, mass rape, ethnic cleansing, and genocidal violence, starvation crimes, and so forth. You don't just wake up and engage in these types of action. You have to have some sort of psychological makeup that make you ready to engage in these types of actions, and they don't disappear overnight. And that also applies to his constituency, which have no problem with him engaging in these types of actions. So I'm afraid that Addis Ababa, the center, will not yield to the rule of law unless it's pressured and compelled to do so. So, that next step, in the first step for the TDF is to develop a deterrence capacity, which I think they have successfully done. The next step is to compel Abiy Ahmed to pursue a political solution. And I don't have the exact solution for how that will happen, but I'm certain that military force is going to be an important component.
Yeah, thank you, Goitom. If you can, Patrick, if you can build on one of the points that Goitom raised in terms of negotiation. I think that the TDF has issued a negotiated ceasefire demand, a 7-point demand that some people have described as a bit too strong, right? How do you think will the international community perceive the demands that the TPLF has put up?
Essentially, a lot of the demands are in line with sort of the thinking of the international community, if well, at least the United States administration under Joe Biden. You saw Secretary Blinken come out this week to say that the constitutional order cannot be changed by force. So that was a new sort of position from the administration in Washington. But you're seeing a lot of the focus of the TDF being on, for instance, opening a humanitarian corridor. So that's one of the main issues that we have to deal with now, that the entire province is being cordoned off on all sides, and that there needs to be a way to get humanitarian access in, whether that's by air, whether that's by a corridor, whatever means that is, the international community needs to be able to provide aid to the populations that are starving right now in Tigray. We're also seeing a focus in terms of a long-term focus more on accountability. So that's going to be something that is going to be brought to the table at a later date. But we're seeing the language of accountability is being emphasized a lot. Returning to the more immediate factors, I mean, you have an entire blockade of the region. So the government seems to have abdicated in its mind, abdicated its responsibility towards Tigrayans, saying, you're saying that you want an independent state now, so that means you're on your own. But not only that means you're on your own, that means we're going to actually withdraw all essential services from you, because the way the Ethiopian government has been set up, it's the central government that provides things like telecommunications, like water, and so you're seeing the government doing the best in its capabilities to prevent people from having access to any essential services. So that's a major issue. Another major issue is just the idea of having some sort of national dialogue, some sort of negotiations. If you designate through parliament the TPLF as a terrorist organization, then how do you then justify entering into negotiations with them? But if they're so militarily powerful that you can't defeat them, then we're sort of at an impasse here. There's no way that the government's not going to be able to engage with them in negotiations, but in doing so, it's going to lose face with its constituency to an extent that the government hasn't been willing to enter into negotiations yet. So that's going to be the the biggest need for pressure points in the international community is just to force the government to actually agree to negotiate with the TPLF. And then all of these other issues that we've spoken of will then sort of be resolved through negotiations, hopefully. But the reality of what we're seeing is that all sides seem to have accepted that it's going to be force that's going to determine the facts on the ground. The idea, Western Tigray is the biggest issue. And I mean, ideally, we would have some sort of constitutional process where we discuss these things. There's competing claims on both sides. Who does this land belong to? What are the administrative units of Ethiopia going to look like in a post-war period? But right now, it's sort of because Abiy and Isaias have said that it's the rule of the gun, the barrel of the gun, that is what's going to determine these things. That I mean, the TDF almost has no choice but to increase its military capabilities. But so that's going to be a major issue going forward in terms of what is the future, what are the future administrative boundaries of the Ethiopian state going to look like?
Yeah, well, I think that the $1 million question is, how is Abiy going to sit down with an organization that he has labeled as a terrorist group, given his stubborn nature? But I think we have kind of run out of time, so I will let Alex have the final remark. Alex, if you had a magic wand to summon all the people in Addis Ababa and Mekelle into a room and give them a piece of advice, what would that be?
I think the key advice now is don't go down the road of turning this into a war of people against people. Up to now, it has been a war of an institutional army against a people's army in Tigray. But if it becomes a war of the Tigrayan people versus the Amhara people, then there will be no Ethiopia. So we're actually at a critical moment at which there is an opportunity to negotiate the beginnings of a peace process, because neither side can prevail. And alternatively, if Abiy persists in his process of changing the Ethiopian state into what it has been, which is a very institutionalized state, into being a state run on popular ethnic sentiment, and especially the sentiment of this sort of imperial nostalgia, which feeds into a particular form of Amhara nationalism. There are other forms too, but the particular form of Amhara nationalism. And we have Amhara versus Tigray as people versus people, then Ethiopia will not exist in a few years.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Goitam, Patrick, and Chelsea. It's been a pleasure. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. Until we see next time, bye-bye.